A couple of things to begin with. First, again, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're standing on, the Darug people. Particularly interesting today to be meeting here in a talking circle, talking about violence when the rest of our nation is celebrating 100 years of the Australian Navy coming into Sydney Harbour, an extraordinary example of violence in our nation, in our world, and a kind of a token in a way of the first fleet that came into the harbour carrying violence on those 12 ships, and getting off the ships and meeting the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation with violence, with uniforms, with guns, approaching in their first conversation with the traditional owners of the land in a violent way. So we're a nation built on violence, and the people who are on the ships as convicts, as prisoners, were also victims of violence, of an abusive system. They were people who'd grown up in poverty and had to steal for their survival and the survival of their children, and they were sent to the other side of the world. So in a way, there's a long history of violence. So again, I also want to acknowledge Ivan, as your welcome, as your acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land, as you pointed that out, that colonisation has had a huge impact on bringing violence to this land, and the long-term impact, the continuing long-term impact that has had on the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today and right across the land. I'd also like to acknowledge Mary Jo, the beautiful way that you grounded our conversation today in your own personal story. And in a way too, your people have been impacted by colonisation, as have my ancestors been impacted by the colonisation of their land in northern England by various waves of people across. So colonisation is a process that has been kind of global and worldwide and destructive and violent. So today, you know, we're meeting here to have a conversation that hopefully is directed towards taking steps towards ending men's violence against women, when our nation is celebrating some fairly big tokens and symbols of the violence of our people, of our nation. I think one of the things that I really appreciated about Mary Jo's sharing with us was the way that she grounded her story of this work in her own personal life journey, and that caused me to reflect on the way that my presence here today is also a part of a process of my life journey that began a good while ago, but growing up on Darug land in Western Sydney in a relatively poor family. Father was a returned soldier, had a market garden in St Mary's, sold the market garden when I was about 4 and bought an FJ Holden utility. Not the wisest of financial decisions, I didn't think, you know, but he liked his FJ Holden ute. So we did have that little token of wealth. I grew up in a safe family, but in a safe family where I knew that I needed to keep being a good boy, and being a good boy meant covering up a lot of things about who I am as a person. I'm just starting to feel a bit emotional as I kind of start to reflect on my story, so I'm not going to go there really, but being a good boy is a part of why I'm here today. You know, there's a long story of doing the right thing and of helping other people, and I began my counsellor training as a relationship counsellor in 1983, so that's 30 years ago, is it? Yep. And I worked for about 7 years as a volunteer counsellor for Life Care Counselling and Family Services, and then in the early 90s, about June 1990, I was employed full-time by Life Care as a regional manager at Campbelltown, managing their Macarthur branch. My first task in that role was to complete a funding submission for the Area Assistance Scheme. And the purpose of the funding that I was looking for was to bring a team of people from the Dulwich Centre in South Australia to New South Wales to do some training with our counsellors about how to identify and respond to domestic violence. One of the things that we'd realised in the agency that I worked for was that we had been working for a long time with some couples and not seeing any change in the couple relationship. And what we identified was the reason that we weren't seeing change was because we weren't addressing the issues of power and control and the issues of domestic violence. So the woman in the couple relationship didn't have an equal safe footing which would enable her to engage effectively in a couple therapy kind of role. So we brought across a team of 3 people from South Australia, and then a little bit later we brought across another trainer from Western Australia who'd had, he was Canadian I believe, who'd had some training with the Duluth model from Minnesota in the States. So both of those areas of training really shaped the way that we responded to domestic violence in the couple therapy setting. And what it helped us to do was to tune in to what the indicators were and to be able to address the safety issues for the woman in that relationship and have different approaches when we assessed and identified that violence was present in that relationship. We also began to start groups. So I think it was in 1992 that we started our first men's group, which we naively called Taking Control. It was subtitled Taking Control of Your Violence, but took us a little while. It was after we had the Duluth training that we kind of really tuned into the idea that, domestic violence was not an issue of, like not having control, blah, 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 whatever, but was about power and control. So we kind of got the philosophy a bit settled and changed the name fairly quickly. But you can imagine what it was like when we would go along to the local domestic violence interagency in the Macarthur region. We used to wear knobs of garlic around our neck in case that we were going to be kind of like attacked somewhere. So we were held with a really high level of disregard and suspicion and even animosity. But Lifecare as a counselling agency persisted and continued to refine their philosophy and understanding, and today continue to provide men's, I would call them psychoeducational groups for men that invite them into exploring change in their lives. So I then moved from Lifecare to Relationships Australia. Lifecare and Relationships Australia are 2 agencies in Sydney, in New South Wales, that have had a long history of working with men who use violence. So that's a part of my journey. I think the other area of my life, I've continued to work in individual therapy sessions, in couple therapy sessions, in group settings around change for men. And my private practice, which I've been in since the end of 2006, in northern Sydney, Campbelltown, Parramatta, Bankstown, they're the areas that I've worked in. And then North Sydney, I thought, oh, at last, a relief from domestic violence. Kind of like, wow, breather, kind of fantastic, lovely North Shore, leafy, suburban couples having trouble with their sexual relationship or whatever. Subtle, powerful, well-dressed, professional, immaculate couples, domestic violence still present. So when we have the knowledge, with the statements that domestic violence covers all socioeconomic groups, all social settings, believe it, it's true, it's just different, it's just kind of more subtle, more difficult to identify. And it's true of same-sex relationships too. The subtlety of domestic violence in same-sex relationships is sometimes creates difficulty in identifying and assessing that and then responding to it. I'm in danger of wandering well off track. I'm an extrovert by personality. Anything that I think comes out my mouth. So, I'm just asking for your patience and, like forgiveness, I guess. Did you mention forgiveness?
Isn't that the F word?
I think it was pardon, I think. So, yeah. I've got my PowerPoint here with some questions on it that are just going to lead me through to keep the extroverted head in line. The first question that I've asked is, why work with men who use violence? What's the point? If you think about a line going across from that side of the room to this side of the room, representing all the men in our society who use violence in their intimate partner relationships, we're going to have a real spectrum, aren't we, of men. We're going to have some men down this end of the spectrum who are like, I call them, really, really, really difficult, really, really, really dangerous, really, really, really unsafe men, really, really unlikely to change. Yeah? If I go down the other end of the room, are you right, Pete? If I go down to the other end of the room, I'm going to have some men who are not really, 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 really dangerous, some men who are abusive, some men who are using physical violence, and then if I get more into the middle, do you get the idea of what I'm talking about? So there's some men up here who I would never want to work with, okay? But there's some men, I reckon from about this table down, really, honestly, I reckon from this table down there are men that I could positively work with to get some change. And what would the change look like? The change would look like they would stop using physical violence. The change would look like they would understand that their abusive behaviour and the fear that their partner has in relation to them is not just about the physical violence that they've used, but the verbal violence and the social control and the financial control, and I'm not going to go through them all, but they'd get some awareness about the ways that their controlling behaviours have impacted on their intimate female partner. So I don't know what you think about that. Just kind of like, can I have a bit of a show of hands? Do you think I'm cracked in the head? Do you think I've lost the plot and I should put the microphone down and go home now, to think that I could effectively engage a man in a conversation about his violence and about ending his violence, leaving those guys there and trying to establish an effective working relationship that is about safety for his partner and his children. The target model from Mary Jo, right? Like, have I lost the plot? No. Okay, good. What do you think, team? I haven't lost the plot. Okay. Phew. So what's the point? What's the point, and what would real change look like? The point is that we want women and children to be safe. Yeah? That's the point. And that's what real change would look like, that a man would become aware of what his behaviour is, what his behaviour is doing, and how he might change his behaviour. And I'm not talking about a behaviour management program or a behaviour change program. I'm talking about a fundamental shift in his knowing, a fundamental shift in his awareness, a fundamental shift in his underlying belief system. Okay, we'll say more about that a little while. So that's what real change would look like. And that's what I'm heading for. I love this model that Mary Jo has given us. The thing that I love about it is this statement up here, safety in men. You know, I think about, every time I hear Mary Jo talk about that, I think about myself as a driver on the roads of New South Wales. And I ask myself the question, every time I get in my car, do I put the key in the ignition and turn the car motor on and put my seatbelt on and put my phone away? Do I consciously think that today, as I drive on the roads in New South Wales, I'm going to be a driver who carries an ethic of safety in me on the roads? Do I carry that ethic in me? Wow, wouldn't our roads be different? We wouldn't need double demerit points on a long weekend, remember, this afternoon? Driving home, double demerit points. It works, you know. Double demerit points and police cars on the road are fabulous deterrents. They keep us on the speed limit. But you know, if we carried that principle of safety in me as a driver, we wouldn't need double demerit points. We wouldn't need the cost of police cars out on the road. We'd all be driving 5Ks under the speed limit, wouldn't we? Who would like to drive this afternoon home carrying safety in you as a commitment? Oh yes! Oh, great! Woo! Beautiful. So one of the things that real change would look like would be that a man would begin to commit himself to being safe in his family. That's, I think, you know, it's kind of like it's a transformational thing. And this is another part of my life, you know, working with men and boys. This is an aside, personal, not professional, but I spend quite a bit of time in weekend workshops with men which allow them to make transformational shifts. I believe that men are beautiful, real, breathing, living, experiencing, noticing, aware people. We are good. Yeah? We're here talking about bad, you know, bad behaviour, but we are good. I believe that about men. I believe that men, often men are wounded, not an excuse. Men have their own stories. So I see the transformational impact that working with men and boys can have in their lives and in their families. One man recently went home from a weekend workshop that I was at, and he contacted his 25-year-old son and invited him over for dinner, and ended the conversation by saying, "I love you." He had never said that to him before. His son came over and spent 2 nights staying at his place. They laid on his bed watching television together, hugging and expressing love for each other. Is that a transformational shift or not? Is transformational shift possible in men or not? Do you believe that? I believe it. Absolutely believe it. And that belief is foundational to my commitment to working with men to end their violence. Those shifts are possible. So you've got the main focus and priority is this. Okay, the main focus and priority is safety for women and children. The main focus is really every conversation I want to have with men is going to be about what are you going to do to end your violence? What are you going to do to take responsibility? How will I know? You know, it's kind of like the conversation is going to be directed towards ending violent behaviour. Okay, establishing safety. That's what the main priority, the main focus is. Alan Jenkins has been mentioned already. I remember, I think, what year was it? 2004, 2003. Mary Jo organised this workshop where she brought Alan over from South Australia, and she sent all the flyers out. I was working with Relationships Australia, and a crew of us from RA Westmead went to the workshop, and it was called
Becoming Ethical.
Discovering Ethics or something. Yeah, and like working with men who use violence. And I was absolutely like, what is she talking about? Discovering ethics. What's he talking about? Working with men who use violence, discovering ethics. That 3-day training course was life-changing for me in the work that I was doing with men. It shifted me from a kind of a fairly self-righteous, fairly, you know, I'm right, you're wrong. Sometimes using quite similar strategies and techniques to what the men would use in their relationships with their partners. Am I sounding kind of like a little, like you've turned the mirror around and you're looking on yourself? You know, sometimes I'd be in conversations where I'd get in an argument with a man and we'd just kind of end up at each other. Okay? So, yeah. Alan has 5 principles for working with men, which I think are really kind of worthy to take note of and to think about. The first one is safety. So we've already talked about that. Absolute priority to the safety of women and children, and absolute priority to this invitation for men to carry safety in them. The second principle is respect. Now I want to start wearing, I'm wearing spectacles, but I want to start wearing re-spectacles, right? If I spect you, I look at you and I see you. If I respect you, I look at you again and I see you differently. And part of the respect I think that we can have for men is to look at them again, to re-see them. And part of re-seeing them is the beautiful way that Maria's entitled today's workshop, which is about working with men who use violence. We did not see the title Working with Violent Men. But how often do we actually think about this work as working with violent men? So we need to re-see them, I think, to re-see them as men, to re-see them as human beings, to re-see them as people with their own stories, to re-see them as people who carry certain belief systems and certain ideas and values which have been absorbed by them. Now, I'm certainly not making excuses for their violence. I'm simply trying to broaden our picture of the way that we respect men. So part of respecting is perhaps identifying some of their ethical intentions, some of what are their genuine ethical intentions. I don't think I've met a man, I'm just trying to be really honest here, I don't think I've met a man who's ever started a relationship and started to have children and thought, I'm just going to be the harshest, toughest, meanest man. I'm just going to keep her in her place and beat the crap out of her and out of the kids. And I'm going to, I don't think that's how men start relationships. Again, I'm at one of those moments, have I lost the plot? I actually don't think that. I was in a circle with some Aboriginal men recently, and we were asked to talk about, just for a minute, about a moment when you felt proud of yourself. And I was standing opposite this young man who was about 18 or 19, and he got to talk first, and he didn't have anything that came to his mind that he wanted to talk about. And so I said, well, I'll have a go if you like. And the first thing that came into my mind was to talk about the day that my eldest daughter was born. It still is a moving moment for me. And so I just shared, what this moment was like when my eldest daughter was born, the day, the moment. And I looked into his face, and his face just went whoosh, opened up, blossomed, smiled, and he said, I know what you mean. And he talked to me about the day that his 3-year-old daughter was born, and the pride in him, So what was I connecting with? What was he sharing with me in that moment? He was sharing with me a really core ethic, a core emotion that's about his joy and his pride and his sense of being a man in being a father. And I think that's quite a universal. I don't talk to many men who really maybe there are some down that end of the room, but the majority of men, I reckon, if I stood over here, I'd reckon the majority of men start off their relationships with hopes, with aspirations, with desires, with longings for that relationship to be a beautiful experience in their lives. So that's respect. Respect is actually seeing into what are the core ethical intentions that men carry within them. Does that make sense? Not seeing them just as their behaviour, not having a label on them which sees their whole person, their whole character, but seeing into their ethical intentions that sit inside quite genuinely, I believe. And tapping those ethical intentions is a part of the work. Tapping those ethical intentions is a part of the engagement of helping men to take steps towards awareness and understanding that will lead to them ending their violence. The 3 other principles are responsibility, and responsibility is simply about being able to talk openly and honestly and to describe actions. The second one is accountability. Accountability is, I think of accountability as understanding the impact that my violence has had on other people. on my partner, on my children. That's understanding the impact and actually committing to taking some action to repair the damage of the impact. And then the last principle is fairness. And I think Mary Jo touched on this when she talked about violence, domestic violence as being a human rights issue. In response to men's use of violence in their intimate partner relationships, I think men ought not to be discarded because of their actions, but should be engaged with and should be supported fairly to make changes, not to ignore the impact of what they've done, not to ignore the seriousness of it, not to put their partner's safety at risk or in jeopardy, not to ignore the impact on their children, but fair to who they are as human beings and fair to their journeys, respectful of their journeys. So I think they're quite important principles. The next note on my PowerPoint is headed "Driving Up Cul-de-sacs." Okay, now you know I've really lost the plot. What do cul-de-sacs have to do? Do you know what a cul-de-sac is? Yeah. It's one of those, you know, you're lost, you're going to a dinner party and you've got your GPS out or your phone in your lap while you're driving. Yeah, safety in, drivers. And you kind of think this is the left-hand turn and you drive up this left-hand turn and you find that the road at the end is a kind of a circle and you have to just drive back out again. You know, we are great, all of us in the room are great at driving up cul-de-sacs when it comes to responding to men's use of violence. How do we do that? Like, we do it all the time whenever we start to think about causal explanations. Mary Jo and I were training in the city one day and one of the guys who was looking after us, so what are you doing today? We're talking about engaging men who use violence. He said, first words come out of his mouth, why? Why do men do that? What causes their violence? You know, it's such a universal question that we hold in our minds, that the community holds in their minds. And we come up with all sorts of explanations, don't we? Let me hear some of them. They come up with all sorts of explanations like, he only does it when he's been drinking, right? Big causal explanation, drugs and alcohol. That's probably the biggest. If only we could get men off the grog and off the pot or off the whatever, women would be safer. No. If only we could send more men to yoga classes and transformational weekend workshops where they could be less stressed, women would be safer. No. What else? What else do we hear? Oh, if only we could get them into therapy to deal with their childhood issues. You know, we have a lot of causal explanations. You have them. We send men off to drug and alcohol rehab, which is not a bad thing, but it doesn't actually change their use of violence. Sending them to relaxation classes. Oh, the classic. Oh, he's got such a short fuse. Let's send him to some anger management. And our courts actually buy into that one. You know, anger management. We'll teach him some behavioural kind of modification things that help him to breathe. You know, not a bad thing really. Breathing's good. I suggest, you know, like, thank you. I suggest that you all take a deep breath now while I do. Have you got my point? How do we know these things are kind of like unhelpful? Because we know there's stacks of people who drink way too much and they are never violent to their intimate female partner. We know that there are stacks of men who drink too much and are violent to their female partner, and then they go to drug and alcohol rehab and they stop drinking and drugging, and they still continue to use violence. Yeah. So there's kind of like some pretty obvious common sense things why causal explanations don't work. So if we're going to ditch causal explanations from our thinking, which also, the causal explanations direct our interventions, that's what's really important, I think, to understand, is that causal explanations direct our interventions. If we think it's drugs and alcohol that cause violence, we're going to have big programs around drug and alcohol rehab. Does that make sense? You know, it's how we think, you know, about what is domestic violence. And the Duluth model in Minnesota, you know, people say, I hear people say, oh, the Duluth model, that's old hat, you know, like feminism's old hat. Yeah, sure. So is breathing, you know. The Duluth model, they say, has never worked in Australia. It's like the research that Mary Jo was talking about. It's never worked in Australia because we've never really done it like Duluth did it in Minnesota. Duluth in Minnesota was a whole of community response to domestic violence, and they reduced the levels of domestic violence absolutely markedly. They had a lot of success because of their combined approach to responding and intervening to domestic violence. So we've not done that here. We haven't had a unified statewide New South Wales process where we've been prepared to work with men. As Mary Jo said, the DOC's funding of training, training Brighter Futures workers how to engage with men was quite revolutionary, really. The first time government money had been set aside to actually acknowledge that working with men might be a reasonable thing to do to contribute towards the safety of women and children. Yeah, so I'm absolutely totally lost. I wasn't sure where I was really going next.
Cul-de-sac.
Cul-de-sac, driving up cul-de-sac, thank you. If causal explanations don't work, then what are we going to put in its place to help us have a framework for understanding men's use of violence? We need a framework for understanding it, don't we? I do. Don't know about you, but I do. So the framework that I use is kind of like to go back and to look at the foundations. Yeah. I love the city when they're doing a whole lot of construction down at Barangaroo at the moment, and it amazes me. It even amazes me going to the car park in this building, how far down into the ground they go with cement and steel and concrete. You know, and you go into the city and you see these huge buildings, and you think, what are they standing on? And you know that they're standing on really deep foundations, deeply embedded foundations in Sydney sandstone, with steel and concrete. So that's what we're standing on, you know? We're standing on deeply embedded historical, cultural, traditional, religious, spiritual foundations. And, you know, if I was going to give a name to the foundations, I'm going to use a really out-of-fashion word, you know? Forgive me in advance, will you? Patriarchy, you know? Believe it or not, we live in a culture that is deeply embedded in patriarchal beliefs. And the one thing, you know what patriarchy means. Now, I don't know, can someone tell me, is that Greek or Roman? I think it's Greek, is it? Who knows? Well, patros means daddy or father, and archy is about rule. So patriarchy is about a culture that's embedded with ideas of the belief in the right of men to rule. Now, this is not a statement about any of the men who are present in the room today, but our culture, our society, is deeply embedded in patriarchal beliefs and ideology. Julia Gillard's prime ministership was dogged by extraordinary misogyny, despite the fact that, you know, people deny that reality. Extraordinary. But based in, and you look at the current cabinet, you know, you're kind of like the glass ceiling in corporate sectors of the community. It's very difficult for a woman to rise to the top. You know, we have traditions. I have 4 daughters, and I only gave, they're all married, I only gave away one of them at the weddings, you know, like gave away, that is, walked down the aisle. Who gives this woman to be married to this man? What an interesting little cultural thing. And engagement rings. If I was a girl, you know, I'd have, if I was a girl, I am a girl, no. If I was a girl, I'd have I'd have serial engagements because I love diamonds. You know, I want as many diamond rings as I can. Engagement rings, they're an interesting little cultural thing, aren't they? I just went to the toilet at the break and I flicked the switch and it said I was engaged. I didn't get a diamond ring though. Right? It's only recently that men have started wearing wedding rings, but they're a real sign of ownership, aren't they? That's the kind of like the culture, that's the history of it. Don't stop asking for diamond rings, girls. Right? You deserve them. But you know, I could go on and on and on about all the cultural kind of practices that we have that are connected to patriarchy. And the one thing, I can tell you this with honest, absolute certainty and truth, all of the men that I've worked with in either a couple or an individual counselling situation or in a group situation where they're addressing their violence, every single one of them held or still continues to hold a belief in their entitlement, their right, their privilege to be in charge. It's a view about their role as men. It's not a causal, it's a contextual factor. Okay? It's a factor that is a part of the fabric of their life and their belief system that then is the context for their use of violence when things don't go their way. So it's a deeply embedded belief. The way that we used to in the men's groups in Life Care and Relationships Australia, we'd get the men to keep a control log, and one of the things they had to fill out at the very beginning was to describe a situation where they'd used a form of abuse against their partner, and they had to describe their actions. That was the first thing they had to do, describe their actions. Good thing to do, that's a responsibility step. Describe what you have done. So for a man in a group to read out his control log where he says, well, the other day we were having a discussion and I did blah, 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 that's a step towards responsibility where he's owning his actions, owning what he's done. The next question was, what were your intentions? So actions, intentions. What did you want to happen by doing that or saying that? Okay. And then the third, the really useful question was, what beliefs supported your intentions and your actions? So you're drilling down. You're not teaching him how to do some deep breathing so that he can control his temper or his anger or whatever. You're actually drilling down to what are his foundations. What are his foundational beliefs about his rights and his entitlement as a man? And you know, time and again, consistently, universally, it would come back to that issue, that his intentions and his actions had their foundations in his beliefs around his rights and privileges and his entitlement. So that's what I mean about driving up cul-de-sacs. Are we going to continue to drive up cul-de-sacs where we go, oh, it's about alcohol, or it's about stress, or it's about his family background, or it's about this, you know? Or are we going to focus our attention on what are the embedded belief systems? And, you know, if we start thinking about our society, if I was Prime Minister of this country, I would be putting a lot of money towards changing our masculinity culture. Not that being a male is a bad thing, but you know, all of the writing that's done, you know, like kind of the book by Maya, and I can't say her last name, can't remember it, Boys Will Be Boys, Breaking the Link Between Masculinity and Violence, was written back in the 80s, I think, still relevant. You know, we think that we're so sophisticated these days. We live in the inner west and our men do the washing and our men look after the kids and our men stay home looking after their kids. We think we're so transformed as a society and that we've pushed through and we've left behind those old models. Well, we haven't. You know, we have not. Those beliefs are still deeply embedded and they still are the foundation to still the context for men's use of violence against their intimate female partners. Ooh. Okay, I've done that one. Oh, okay. You know, a story about fishing. That's what my next PowerPoint thing says. A story about fishing. When I was 16, my mum, who was the mother of 7 children, she was pregnant with twins, 6 months pregnant with twins, and my dad thought it was a really, really good idea to have a fishing trip on the Hawkesbury River on a little kind of cruiser. So I still have this picture of my mum where she's sitting up the back of the boat. She had 2 girls, and between them they weighed over 16 pounds. Okay, so they were quite healthy, robust babies. So at 6 months, there was mum, this photograph of her sitting up the back of the boat with her big belly, untangling fishing lines, and I think she spent the whole weekend untangling fishing lines for her 4 sons. But my dad taught us how to catch flathead that weekend. Okay, this is a fine art to catch flathead. Where do flatheads swim? On the bottom, yeah. They swim in the mud. Now, I'm not wanting to make a connection between flathead and the use of that word to men who use violence, because that would be disrespectful. But there's a bit of a metaphor here. Often men who use violence swim out of sight, you know, behind closed doors, all of that sort of stuff. So the engagement of men who use violence is a very fine art, just as is the catching of flathead. Surprisingly, on that weekend fishing trip, there wasn't a single flathead that swam to the surface and jumped into our boat. Not a single flathead jumped into the boat. It took really careful, skillful use of the right hook, use of a sinker of the right weight, use of the right bait, use of the right technique in pulling it in, use of the right strategy, and gradually they fight like hell when they're on line, when they're hooked. That's an interesting little parallel. Yeah, so, and then when you get them up to near the top of the water, you can't just drag them out of the water, because that's when they fight hardest, and they often bite the line or manage to break off somehow. So you have to have the net out underneath. Are you getting kind of the picture? Whose responsibility is it to catch the flathead? The flathead, for him to go, oh, okay, here I am, bite the hook, have the prawn, off I go, have me for dinner, jump in the boat. The person who's got the fishing line, you know, you've got to have the skill, you've got to have the technique right. So look, I think that just says to us as workers, this little fishing story is, you know, how often do we say, oh, he's such a resistant man, oh, he's so up himself, oh sorry, he's so arrogant, he's so this, he's so that. How many people have heard them, don't put your hand up, how many people have heard themselves saying stuff like that about men who use violence? Yeah, we all have. I'm not even looking. But, you know, we all disrespect men who use violence by the way that we speak about them. Alan Jenkins wrote an interesting article in 1994 called Therapy for Abuse or Therapy as Abuse. And he said he acknowledged his part, the part of him that when he was working with a man wanted to grab him by the throat and strangle him, you know, and use the same strategies that this man uses on against his intimate female partner. So a real challenge for us to kind of take a different position, to stand against the strategies and tactics that he uses, to engage and to invite the man into a place of change. If we send a man home from some kind of connection with him where he's really angry with us and cross with us and stirred up and adversarial, who's going to be at risk? Yeah, his partner. So the responsibility for engagement and for safe and effective engagement sits with us as workers. And if we're not trained in that work, then we have a responsibility to be trained. If we're in a situation where we're working with men who use violence, if we are in some situation where we have contact with men who use violence, we need to know what we are doing. We need to know how to fish. And we need to know how to fish properly. We need to know how to engage. So Alan Jenkins invites us to an ethical response. This is a beautiful word, and I find it really challenging, to be honest, because sometimes when I'm sitting with an individual man in a therapeutic setting, which is mostly the way that it happens these days. I don't co-facilitate groups anymore. But thinking back to those experiences, sometimes it's really, really difficult to hold a position as a worker that is grounded in an ethical response. So what do I mean? What does Alan Jenkins mean by an ethical response? If you haven't bought his book, which is called Reclaiming Ethic.
Becoming ethical.
Becoming, that's the word. Becoming Ethical, Alan Jenkins. Do we all know it? Have you all kind of got it and read it? With respect to Alan, he's not your kind of like bedtime reading kind of guy. He's your Sunday morning or Saturday morning or Monday morning, sit down, read a paragraph at a time, underline it, write about it, put questions beside it, figure out what is he saying. He's such a beautiful, beautiful thinker and, challenging. So the ethical response, the thing that I've taken from that is that when a man comes in and sits down in front of me and I begin to hear him talking about his relationship and I begin to hear him talking about stuff that he does and I make a few inquiries and I get a picture fairly clearly about his use of violence, then the ethical response from me is to stay tuned in to what are the underlying ethics within that man, rather than, I want to stay tuned to safety, but if I want to actually make a difference in this man's life and invite him to a place where he stops using violence so his partner's safe. I love that picture that Mary Jo gave us of the cereal baton, like a relay race in the Olympics where a violent man charges off with the baton and he's abusive to one wife and then the services come in and we get her to safety and then he keeps running with the baton in his hand to find another partner to give the baton to and he runs alongside of her and he's abusive to her and the services come in and they help her and they get her to safety and then he keeps running around the track. Do you know that kind of, we've currently got a Royal Commission into institutionalised sexual abuse where institutions swept things under the carpet, moved priests or teachers around from parish to parish or diocese to diocese or state to state where they continued to abuse. We've kind of done the same thing in our services. We move men around from relationship to relationship where they continue to abuse. So why work with men? Because there are transition points in their lives and in their experiences of relationship where they are amenable to change, and we have to tap into those. There are times when they're swimming in the mud and they see a prawn on a hook and they bite at it. There are moments, transitional moments of change that's possible for men. And part of that is when we are prepared to listen for and respond to their ethical intentions, their ethical beliefs, the things that are true for them. Being a dad is really, really crucial to me. Being a good dad, I want to love my kids. I don't want my kids to be frightened of me. Wow, you don't want your kids to be frightened of you. Can you hear an ethical intention in that? I can. These are the things that men say all the time. They might even say, I'm not happy with myself. I don't like it. I think we've got to believe that. The beautiful cycle of abuse that was developed 40 years ago, I think has been beautifully helpful, but in some ways unhelpful, because how it's got the remorse buyback phase of that, which, like women know that they go through this cycle. The remorse buyback phase are often disregarded by us as a transitional moment for men where change might be possible. Okay? Remorse is a genuine feeling. Men genuinely do not, I'm talking about the majority of men who are in this group here. They generally do not like themselves when they use violence. They genuinely want to be different. We have to listen for that and respect it and respond to it, instead of putting them all of them, into that little category over there, who are the really hard nuts to crack. Yeah? So I'm going to finish off with the last. So Alan's work really invites us to, I've got 2 more points to go. How about that?
You have like 7 minutes, you're good.
I got 5 minutes? Yeah, beautiful. So Alan's work really invites us to have a response to what I would describe as listening for and responding to and drawing out men's genuine ethical intentions about their place within their family, and invite them to that place there, that place that was there, carrying safety in them. You know, part of his framework, and if you know nothing else about his book, Becoming Ethical, you might look at the section where he talks about the balances of accountability, and there he has a 4-step process, which is not necessarily linear, but it's the first one is addressing overload. You can't work with a man if he's overloaded. There has to be a relationship, a talking relationship, where we've talked about the talking and we've established a strong foundation for having a conversation with him. So addressing his overload is a first step. The second step is exploring his ethical intentions. The third step is repositioning his shame. And the fourth step is establishing an ethical journey. And it's that part that's the really crucial part, that fourth step. All 4 steps are vital. It's the fourth step that has 3 steps within it. And the first one is inviting the man to address his violence. So inviting the man to speak honestly about his use of violence and all forms of abuse that fit within that. Getting him to imagine if we were looking at a CTC camera and watching the particular incident, what would we see him doing? What would we hear him saying? What would we see in his actions? So that's a really simple little strategy of a way of getting a man to address his violence. So establishing an ethical journey is, number 1, addressing his violence. Number 2 is building some awareness and understanding of the impacts of his violence. And number 3 is about kind of like getting a sense of the damage that he's done and taking some steps towards repairing that damage. That's his ethical journey. Talk honestly about what you've done, get a sense of what the impact of that's been, and take some steps towards fixing the damage that you've done, repairing the damage that you've done. So that's the invitation in a nutshell that I would be offering to a man who uses violence. And you know, that's a steady, gentle, respectful process. And to finish off with, Alan Jenkins offers us an invitation too, and that invitation is to walk a parallel political journey. So in a nutshell really, it's to address our own beliefs about entitlement and privilege. It's to address our own beliefs about the use of violence. It's to address our own sense of who we are in the world and how we relate to other people, whether we relate from a power dynamic, a power over dynamic, or a power with. And just let me say this, having worked in agencies for many years, one of the things I notice, and you may notice this too, that there is another parallel process that goes on, that when we're working with violence in the community, that violence, those abusive behaviours are often replicated within the structures and the hierarchy and the relationships of a workplace. One of the first presentations I did on domestic violence was in Tasmania to a group of women in a women's refuge, and I just presented the power and control wheel. It was back in the early 90s. The next day a woman came to me having rewritten the power and control wheel, describing her experience of her workplace, of power and control in the workplace amongst her colleagues. So, you know, this is a really interesting issue. So the invitation that Alan has for us, if we're working in this field, is to walk the same political journey that we might be inviting the men to walk. What integrity do we have if we see it as them and us? And what integrity do we have if we stand on a higher ground and look down at and disrespect? The integrity comes when we are prepared to walk a parallel political journey of safety and of respect and of justice and of non-violence. And to finish on a spiritual note, the Dalai Lama of Tibet says, every act of violence, especially when you're driving. You think I'm being sponsored by the Roads and Traffic Authority, don't you? I'm not. It's just so, it's kind of like it keeps coming back to me because that's the place where I'm most abusive, is behind the wheel of the car, you know. That's the place where I'm working on getting into my car and saying, okay, today, safety, safety, safety in me. You know, the Dalai Lama says every act of violence sows the seed for another act of violence. And I think kind of fundamentally the core of it. And the invitation is for us to walk that political journey of a non-violent life. It starts with us. Thank you.